In the early morning hours of October 12, 2012, Sarah and Elijah Green loaded up their silver Subaru Outback and pulled out of their driveway in Richmond, Virginia. They had been married for just under 3 years, no kids yet, both in their late 20s, and they had a quiet kind of happiness, the kind that doesn't make much noise but fills the whole room. The weekend ahead was meant to be peaceful. They were heading to Windmere Ridge, a remote corner of western North Carolina tucked up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where a friend of Elijah's family owned a private cabin available for rent. It was off-grid, no cell reception, no Wi-Fi, but for the Greens, that was the appeal. A fireplace, a stocked kitchen, a trailhead nearby, and no distractions. Elijah had joked to his brother the night before that it would be a no shoes, no signal kind of weekend. Along the route, they stopped for coffee in Lynchburg, Virginia, then drove another 5 hours into the mountains. Somewhere around 4:30 p.m., Sarah sent a photo to her mother. It showed her smiling on the front porch of the cabin, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other holding Elijah's hand. Behind them, the woods were already turning red and gold. The text read, "We made it. No signal here. Love you." That was the last time anyone heard from either of them. By Monday morning, the couple hadn't returned to Richmond as planned. Neither had shown up to work. Sarah's mother assumed they were simply taking a detour, maybe staying an extra day. Elijah's supervisor, however, filed a missing persons report by 10 a.m. The owner of the cabin was contacted first. He lived in Asheville and hadn't been aware the couple hadn't checked out. By 3 p.m., a local deputy was dispatched to the property. That's when things started to feel wrong. The Subaru was still there, parked just where Sarah had stood for the photo. All doors locked, no damage. The tires were clean, no sign of a hurried getaway or attempt to leave. There were 2 mugs still sitting on the porch railing, both stained with what appeared to be leftover tea. Inside, the cabin felt lived in, but only barely. The couple's duffel bags were placed at the foot of the bed. Jackets were hung neatly on hooks by the door. A pair of boots sat by the hearth. A pan with uncooked onions and chopped peppers sat on the stove, cold and untouched. A bottle of unopened wine rested on the counter beside 2 glasses. The water hadn't been turned on. The bed was made. The fireplace was clean. It was as if the couple had arrived, taken a moment to breathe, and then vanished. Search teams were mobilized that same night. Dozens of local volunteers fanned out into the hills with headlamps and search dogs. They combed the trails, the slopes behind the cabin, the narrow gravel roads that wind down into the low country. But there was nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no scent trail. The dogs would pick something up near the porch, follow it a few yards toward the woods, then sit down. Dead air. Over the next 2 days, drones were deployed. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the valley. Park rangers reviewed trail cams in the national forest bordering the cabin's land. But there were no sightings of Sarah or Elijah, no movement at all. It was as though the trees had swallowed them. Deputies returned to the cabin daily, taking swabs, bagging items, and documenting every inch of the space. But there were no signs of a struggle. No broken glass, no blood, no defensive marks. There were no fingerprints other than the couple's and the owner's. The guest book, a small leather-bound log kept in the entryway, had their names in a short message. "Can't wait to hike tomorrow. S+E." That was dated October 12th. A week later, the case made local news, then state news. And by the second week, national outlets began running headlines. Virginia couple vanishes on romantic cabin getaway. Online theories exploded. Some said they faked their own deaths. Others blamed a bear attack, a robbery gone wrong, or a rogue squatter. But without bodies, without evidence, nothing could be proven. The cabin was sealed and eventually reopened by the owner, who continued to rent it to others, though never without a lingering story attached. Over the years, the Green case became a sort of local myth, a cautionary tale. Don't go up to Windermere without telling someone your route. Don't hike alone. Don't trust what you can't explain. Every year, Sarah's family held a vigil. Every year, Elijah's brother retraced parts of the trail behind the cabin, hoping to find even a scrap of clothing or a scrap of truth. But for 11 years, there was nothing. Just silence and trees. Until someone tore out the fireplace. And then, everything changed. Deputy Wade Harrell was the first officer on scene, arriving just before dusk. He'd responded to all kinds of calls up in the ridge country. Drunken hikers, black bear sightings, even a lightning strike that split a pine tree clean through a cabin roof. But something about this one was different. When he pulled up the gravel drive, the first thing he noticed was the complete stillness. The car was there. No damage, no one inside. But there were 2 mugs on the porch rail, each with a faint ring of dried tea inside, like they'd been left only minutes earlier. The owner of the cabin, a man named Curtis Dell, waited off to the side. He said he hadn't been out in weeks, just happened to check in when he realized the guests hadn't messaged about checkout. The cabin was only a few hundred square feet, single level, with a loft for storage. When Deputy Harrell stepped inside, he expected signs of a break-in, maybe broken glass, some struggle, even a robbery. But the scene where I met him was clean. Too clean. 2 duffel bags sat near the bed, unzipped but untouched. Clothes were neatly folded on the end of the mattress. A hiking backpack leaned against the closet, still zipped. In the small kitchen, the skillet on the stove held partially sautéed onions and peppers, cold now and starting to dry at the edges. A bottle of wine sat beside 2 glasses on the counter, both clean, unused. The door was locked from the inside. The windows shut. No forced entry, no blood, no mess. It looked like a couple who had just arrived, started dinner, and then... What? Stepped outside and evaporated? Deputy Harrell called it in. Within 2 hours, backup arrived from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The cabin was sealed. Forensics began the slow process of cataloging every detail. They dusted for prints. Only 3 sets came up: Sarah's, Elijah's, and Curtis's. Nothing on the doorknobs that didn't match. No prints on the windows. No hair samples outside the norm. There was no sign of a third person ever being inside. The search began the next morning. Volunteers, cadaver dogs, state search and rescue. Dozens gathered at the base of the ridge trail that began just 100 yards behind the cabin. It was rugged terrain, dense pine, narrow rock outcroppings, sudden drop-offs. The kind of land that didn't forgive mistakes. If Sarah and Elijah had gone hiking and gotten lost, this would have been the place. But the search dogs couldn't hold a scent for more than a few yards past the cabin. The trailhead yielded nothing. No footprints, no wrappers, no dropped gear. A slight depression in the dirt could have been a heel mark, but it was too shallow to tell. By the 3rd day, teams had covered over 6 square miles. Helicopters scanned from above. Creek beds were checked. A ranger rappel team examined steep drop-offs and cliff edges. Still nothing. No clothing, no blood, no footprints. It was as if the couple had never left the porch. Detectives began working alternate theories. Maybe they never stayed. Maybe they arrived, got into trouble elsewhere, and someone backfilled the scene. But there was no evidence to support that. A security cam from a gas station 30 miles away confirmed the couple stopped and bought groceries, bags that were now in the cabin's fridge. A neighbor 2 ridges down remembered hearing laughter echo through the trees on the evening of the 12th. He'd assumed it was campers. Cell phone records placed their devices in the cabin vicinity just before they went offline. The only solid timestamp came from the guest book. In Sarah's neat handwriting, the line read, "Can't wait to hike tomorrow." S+E, dated October 12th. No other guests had signed since, and no entries appeared after it. There was no way to know what happened between that hopeful note and the moment the first deputy walked in. Theories spread fast. Wildlife attack, accidental fall, a wrong turn on an unmarked trail. But the couple weren't reckless. Friends said they were careful planners. Sarah never went anywhere without a printed map. Elijah had taken a wilderness safety course 2 summers prior. Some pointed to the region's strange history. Windmere Ridge had long been whispered about by locals. In the late 80s, a hermit disappeared after building a shelter up there. In the 60s, 2 teenagers went missing during a winter hike. Only 1 body was ever found. But these were just stories, and stories didn't hold up in court. As the week dragged on, the search effort slowed. The official line was still missing persons, but without signs of struggle or evidence of crime, investigators were left with only guesses. The family's calls became more frequent. Sarah's sister posted flyers along the highway. Elijah's brother made a YouTube video asking for help. But there was nothing to report, no sightings, no ransom, no digital activity. By the end of the month, a lead detective admitted off the record that they were stuck. The cabin was clean. Too clean. As if someone had wiped away the end of a story before anyone could read it. And whatever had happened between that untouched skillet and the cold fire pit, it had left no trace worth following. On the 7th day of the search, just when most teams had accepted they'd found all they were going to find, a volunteer spotted something strange near a bend in the lower trail. The area had already been combed twice, but the terrain made it easy to miss things. This particular stretch of forest was steep, lined with thick brush and narrow shale ridges that crumbled under weight. It was just before noon when the volunteer, a retired fireman named Pete Holloway, paused near a moss-covered slope and noticed something the others had missed. Boot prints, clear, deliberate, and human. There were 3 prints in total, medium size, likely a man, not running, walking, not erratic, not dragging. But they stopped just shy of a tall outcropping of boulders and went no farther. The forest floor beyond them was undisturbed. No scuffs, no branch breaks, no trail. Deputies were called back in. Forensics photographed and cast the prints. The sole pattern didn't match Elijah's known hiking boots, nor Sarah's, and the prints didn't lead to the cabin. They led away from it. A straight path, then nothing. Less than 50 yards away, tangled in a low-hanging pine branch, a member of the sheriff's auxiliary spotted a torn piece of paper. It had water damage, curled edges, and soil on the fold. At first glance, it looked like garbage. But when opened, it revealed a hand-drawn topographic sketch, crudely drawn but legible. A red X was marked on the far right quadrant, just off a fire service road that hadn't been used in decades. The handwriting was rough, with inconsistent slants and no signature. It didn't match Sarah or Elijah's writing. It didn't match the guest book entry either. The page was bagged, photographed, and sent for analysis. Investigators retraced the map to its likely target and organized a targeted sweep of the X location the next day. What they found was nothing. A dry hollow surrounded by overgrown brush, dotted with empty beer cans and sun-bleached litter. No signs of disturbance, no blood, no clothing. Just a quiet patch of land like any other. Still, the strange details built pressure on the department. Locals began whispering more openly now, some to the media, others to online forums. Stories that had lived quietly in the community for decades were now surfacing in Reddit threads and amateur podcasts. Rumors about Windmere Ridge being cursed. Some residents even refused to enter the trail system altogether. One older man in town told a reporter that Windmere doesn't like being visited twice. Another name started surfacing in these conversations: Harold Dietrich. In the 1980s, Dietrich had been a known survivalist who built an off-grid shelter somewhere in the ridge system. He'd withdrawn from society after a public falling out with family in Tennessee. Locals recalled seeing him at supply runs, always alone, always guarded. He was rumored to be paranoid, armed, and possibly unstable. In 1987, he vanished. No body was found. Some believed he died in a winter storm. Others believed he simply moved deeper into the mountains, erasing his trail on purpose. Police, trying to quiet speculation, stated publicly that the survivalist theory was unlikely and unfounded. They reiterated that the found boot prints could be from an earlier hiker and that the torn map was not definitive proof of foul play. The terrain was full of old markers, trail users, and unrelated wanderers. But behind closed doors, they didn't have a better explanation. Officers returned to the boulder outcrop multiple times. Drones were flown above it. FLIR cameras scanned for heat sources in case someone was sheltering in the rock crevices. But the only consistent thing was how inconsistent the evidence had become. The forest didn't seem to want to give up answers. Tracks vanished, dogs lost scent, even the weather shifted strangely. Sun 1 hour, thick fog the next. Weeks passed, new leads dwindled. The search radius was expanded again, then scaled back. Eventually, the county declared the active search suspended. Volunteers still hiked it from time to time. Some came with cameras. Others came just to say they'd been where the couple disappeared. But no one stayed long, and no one found anything new. The official stance from the sheriff's department became clinical. No sign of struggle, no confirmed foul play, no bodies. A cold case, but still open. But among those who had been there, who'd walked those trails, who'd stood at the edge of those boot prints and stared into the wall of stone beyond them, there was a shared, unspoken understanding. Something had happened, and it had left no trace. Windmere Ridge became quieter. Fewer hikers, more closed trails. The rental cabin was still listed online, though bookings had dropped. Some who stayed said they felt watched. Others left early without giving a reason. Curtis, the owner, kept it open but stopped advertising. Even he admitted, "It just feels hollow now." By the end of the year, the Green family returned home without answers. They held a memorial. Elijah's brother stopped returning reporters' calls. Sarah's mother kept their bedroom the same. 2 toothbrushes, a half-filled journal, a printed map with a note scribbled in the corner. Hike tomorrow. That hike never happened, and the forest, to this day, has never given back their names. 11 weeks after Sarah and Elijah Green vanished, the phones at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office had mostly gone quiet. The media coverage had faded, the search teams were long gone, and official statements had stalled out into a familiar refrain. No new developments at this time. The case had slipped into that uncomfortable stage, too recent to be forgotten, too cold to chase full-time. But then, a message came in through the department's online tip portal. It wasn't from a psychic or a conspiracy theorist or an internet sleuth. It was from a woman named Gladys Dietrich. She lived 2 counties over and wanted to talk about her husband's handwriting. Detective Aaron Mallory was the one who followed up. Gladys answered the door in a worn cardigan and invited her in without a second thought. She wasn't confused, wasn't rambling, just cautious. Her husband, Harold Dietrich, had died over 20 years ago, but she believed something he left behind might be relevant. A few days earlier, her nephew had been reading about the Green case online and stumbled across a photo of the torn map found near the boulders behind the cabin. When he showed it to her, she froze. The slanted capital H, the uneven spacing, the heavy pressure on the downstrokes. She said she'd seen it before, in Harold's old notebooks. She brought out a small cardboard box. Inside were field journals, yellowing, weather-warped but intact. Harold had kept meticulous notes during the years he lived off-grid. He'd logged plant species, built diagrams of his lean-to shelter, even documented storm paths. And scattered throughout the pages were sketches of hand-drawn maps. Some simple things, some intricate. One in particular showed a nearly identical topographic layout to the one found near the Windmere Ridge boulders. Same general outline, same fire road curve, and in the upper right corner, an X in red. The handwriting was unmistakable. Detective Mallory took the materials and sent them for analysis. A week later, the lab confirmed the match. The torn map was almost certainly drawn by Harold Dietrich, decades before the Greens ever booked the cabin. This revelation reopened several questions. If Harold died in 1997, how did a map he drew end up hanging from a tree branch in 2012? Who had carried it? And more importantly, what was the X marking? Investigators returned to the cabin with renewed focus. A forensic specialist named Denise Calloway was tasked with re-examining the guest book. The book had been processed before, but never enhanced beyond the visible entries. Sarah and Elijah's message, "Can't wait to hike tomorrow, S+E," was still the last clear note. But now, Denise began scanning the page under alternate light sources. That's when she found it. Just beneath the Greens' cheerful entry, Pressed faintly into the page was a second line, barely visible, written in graphite, but faded and smeared. Under infrared enhancement, the words came into focus. I remember this place. It reminds me it had been written without a signature. The graphite had been partially rubbed away, likely by the same hand that turned the page to sign above it. But it wasn't Sarah's writing, and it wasn't Elijah's. Analysis showed different stroke angles, inconsistent pressure, and a slant in the characters not present in either of the Green's known samples. The phrase itself was unsettling. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a quote. It felt personal, maybe even confessional. And more importantly, it wasn't in any of Harold's notebooks, which meant someone else had written it, someone who had been in the cabin after Harold died, someone who may have been using it without the owner's knowledge. Investigators brought Curtis Dell, the cabin owner, back in for questioning. He swore the place had been unoccupied before the Greens arrived, but records were thin. The rental process had been casual, mostly word of mouth through family friends. There were no security cameras, no check-in system. And Curtis admitted he didn't inspect the guest book often. The cabin could have been used without his knowledge, and the smudged entry might have been sitting there for years. The question now was simple. Who wrote that line? Detectives combed through guest book entries going back a decade. Most were innocuous: families, couples, solo hikers. A few names stood out. One was an Army veteran who'd stayed multiple times over the years. Another was a backpacker who later died in a climbing accident out west. But no clear suspect emerged. It was possible, they realized, that whoever had written the message hadn't signed their name at all. They may have just slipped in, left their mark, and vanished again. As the weeks passed, the case shifted in tone. What had once felt like a missing person search now carried the weight of something darker, something older. Whoever had taken or found the map had knowledge of the ridge. Whoever wrote in that book had been there when no one else was looking. Theories circled like vultures: a drifter using the cabin as shelter, a hermit who'd taken up Harold's mantle, someone local perhaps with a reason to keep that part of the woods for themselves. But there was no way to know. What stuck with everyone, what wouldn't let go, was the phrasing of that final line. It remembers me. Now I remember it. This place is familiar, but it remembers me. As if the ridge itself had a memory, as if it had been waiting. And now, 2 more names had joined the list of those who walked into those woods and never walked out. In the spring of 2023, Curtis Dell finally made the decision he'd been putting off for years. The cabin up on Windmere Ridge hadn't been booked in over a year. Guests left vague reviews, citing a heavy feeling or uneasy sleep. The property taxes had crept up. His wife had started calling it the haunted one. After 11 years, he figured it was time to sell. Clean it up, modernize a few things, put it on the market, and be done with it. He started with the Fireplace. It was original to the structure, stone-faced, shallow, and always a little too smoky when lit. The foundation beneath had started to crack, and a local contractor advised replacing the whole hearth to stabilize the cabin's center. On a rainy Thursday morning in March, Curtis began pulling up the first layer of stone himself. Dust and ash spilled out from beneath the grate. At first, he didn't think much of it, years of soot and runoff collecting where no broom had reached. But then he saw something glinting, a small, round object nestled in the ash. He picked it up and turned it in his fingers. A glass bead, pale blue, smooth, and intact. He kept digging. Beneath a layer of darker ash, there was a second object, thin, curved, lighter than it should have been. It crumbled slightly in his grip. At first, he thought it might be part of a broken utensil, but the shape wasn't right. It looked almost organic, bone-like. The third item stopped him cold. It was metallic, flattened from heat, with threads of melted plastic clinging to the edges. A zipper pull, the kind you'd find on a jacket or a sleeping bag. Curtis backed out of the cabin and made the call. Jackson County deputies arrived 2 hours later. This time, it wasn't just a deputy or two and a notepad. It was a full forensic team. They sealed off the cabin immediately, erected a temporary tent over the hearth, and began pulling the surrounding floorboards. All remaining ash, debris, and masonry were removed in labeled bags. The initial visual survey of the fireplace interior revealed evidence of high heat exposure, far beyond what a standard fire would produce. The surrounding stone was scorched deep, as though it had been superheated for hours. The firebox itself showed signs of tampering. Someone at some point had removed the metal grating and widened the cavity, allowing for more oxygen intake. It wasn't just a fireplace anymore. It had functioned like a crude incinerator. By the next day, rumors were spreading. Word reached Sarah Green's mother before officials could brief the family. She got the call from a reporter, not the department. By that evening, media outlets had caught up to the story. Human remains found in long vacant cabin where couple vanished. Every old theory was resurrected overnight: cult involvement, forest serial killer, federal cover-up. The cabin's listing was pulled. The property was cordoned off, now a formal crime scene for the first time in a decade. At the State Forensics Lab in Raleigh, the analysis began. The glass bead was confirmed to be of the same type Sarah Green had been photographed wearing on a necklace. The last photo she ever sent, standing on that porch in 2012. The zipper pull was traced to a brand of outdoor jacket Elijah had reportedly owned, though heat damage prevented a perfect match. The most significant find was the bone fragment, less than 2 inches long, pale and brittle. It had to be tested multiple times to confirm, but it was human, specifically a sliver of a distal phalanx, a fingertip bone, female, age range consistent with Sarah Green at the time of her disappearance. That single bone changed the status of the case. It was no longer classified as a missing persons investigation. It was now a homicide inquiry. Detectives began contacting everyone who had stayed in the cabin since 2012. Rental records were spotty. Curtis had operated under a mix of direct bookings and informal rentals, sometimes not logging names at all. But over 60 separate parties had slept inside that cabin in the years following the Greens' disappearance. None had reported anything unusual about the fireplace. Some had even used it, cooked over it, sat near it. No one had ever noticed what was buried inches below. Detective Mallory returned to the site with new eyes. The fireplace had always seemed oddly placed, off-center, unusually shallow. Now she walked the perimeter with measured steps, imagining the weight of what had happened. Someone had used this hearth to hide something, not just evidence, a person, and they'd done it well enough that no one noticed for 11 years. Public speculation exploded. Why hadn't it been discovered sooner? How had over 60 renters missed it? Was it an accident, a panic, or something premeditated? Investigators kept details close: the bone, the bead, the zipper. They held back the full report from the press. Only the family knew how small the fragment really was, that there was no skull, no torso, no dental record, only a fingertip. But it was enough. Sarah had never left that cabin. Part of her, at least, had remained there all along, burned into stone and soot and silence. For the first time, the family had something they could touch, something to bury. But it came with a new question. If Sarah died in that cabin, where was Elijah, and who lit the fire? The report came back in stages, each one tightening the grip on the story that had never quite let go of Jackson County. First was the bone. The forensic lab confirmed it was human, specifically a right distal phalanx, the outermost tip of a finger. The growth plates, the wear pattern, and the remaining tissue residue suggested it belonged to a female in her mid to late 20s. A sample was sent for mitochondrial DNA analysis. 3 weeks later, the match came through. Sarah Green. Probability of error, less than 0.0001%. The family was notified that same day. They weren't given photographs, just the facts. That a piece of Sarah had been found in the fireplace where she'd last been seen. That it had likely been there the entire time. That even after all the search teams, cadaver dogs, and investigators, it had taken a contractor's crowbar and a half-day demolition to bring her back. The necklace was next. 2 more glass beads, identical in color and shape to the one Curtis found first, had been recovered from the deeper ash layers. One had fused slightly to a piece of scorched stone. Both were consistent with the necklace Sarah wore in the last photo she sent her mother. It was custom-made, purchased on Etsy in 2010, and included a series of pale blue check glass beads that weren't commonly sold in stores. Her sister identified it immediately. "That's hers," she said. "No doubt." But what held the attention of fire investigators was the condition of the ash itself. Burn patterns on the firebox interior, stone discoloration, and the chemical composition of the remaining soot told a more disturbing story. According to fire analysis reports, the temperature inside the fireplace had reached between 1,600 and 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit at its peak, far higher than what could be achieved by a standard wood fire. That kind of heat required an accelerant, possibly kerosene, possibly gasoline, and it had to be maintained. A short flare wouldn't do it. Someone had tended that fire for hours. The lab confirmed traces of oxidized metal consistent with a zipper pull. After further testing, they narrowed it to a specific brand of hiking jackets sold between 2010 and 2013. It matched the exact jacket Elijah Green had been photographed wearing on a hiking trip to Shenandoah National Park a year before his disappearance. The odds of someone else owning the same brand, size, and model weren't impossible, but the presence of that zipper, melted and buried beneath layers of char, placed Elijah at the scene alongside Sarah. Detectives returned to the cabin with a search warrant. This time, they tore it apart piece by piece. Wall panels, floor joists, foundation blocks, every nail and beam was cataloged. Ground-penetrating radar was used on the surrounding soil. Cadaver dogs were brought in again, but no new remains were found. Just that single fragment, just enough to redefine the case. On paper, the classification shifted from missing persons to homicide investigation. The word mattered. It unlocked new jurisdictional resources, new lines of questioning, new legal reach. But it didn't answer the central question: who had burned Sarah Green in that fireplace, and why? Curtis Dell, the property owner, was cleared quickly. He had a solid alibi for the weekend in question and no financial or personal connection to the Greens. His booking records showed no unauthorized entries in the cabin between rentals. But that meant whoever had done this had either used the cabin under Curtis's nose or had been there before. The detail that disturbed investigators the most wasn't just the presence of human remains in the hearth. It was how clean the rest of the cabin had remained. The scene had looked untouched for over a decade. There was no evidence of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks, just 2 folded jackets, 2 untouched wine glasses, and a skillet left cooling on the stove. In hindsight, those items became darker. Someone had let them unpack, maybe even let them eat. Then something went very wrong. And after it did, that person hadn't panicked. They had planned, adjusted the fireplace, controlled the burn, removed most of the evidence, and then walked out the front door without leaving a trace. The team began revisiting everyone who had ever stayed in the cabin since 2012. Rental records were incomplete. Several names had been scribbled in Curtis's notebook, some just first names, others illegible. Guests who could be tracked down were questioned. Most remembered nothing unusual. A few described odd noises at night, scratching, shifting. One woman said she'd smelled something metallic when the fire was lit, but assumed it was the old chimney flue. None of them suspected a body had ever been beneath their feet. Detective Mallory and her team returned to the guest book again. This time, they looked not just at names but pressure points on the pages. Where graphite was heavier, where someone had lingered. They created a timeline of entries, cross-referenced handwriting. Still, the one line, "I remember this place, it remembers me," remained the only ghost in the book. Back in Richmond, Sarah's mother sat quietly with the news. She asked only one question. Was it quick? No one could answer that. The cabin was sealed indefinitely. The investigation widened, but now they had a starting point. The fire wasn't symbolic. It wasn't metaphorical. It had been practical, purposeful, and it had left behind more than just Ash. It had left behind someone's mistake, the smallest piece, the wrong bone in the wrong place, and that mistake, 11 years later, had begun to bring everything else up to the surface. The message came in through the department's general inbox, buried between a spam complaint and a floodplain permit request. The sender was a man named Wesley Rudd, who introduced himself as a hiking vlogger based out of Georgia. He said he'd been following the Sarah and Elijah Green case since the recent discovery at the cabin. His email was short, almost hesitant. He said he might have something worth looking at, something from 10 years ago. Detective Mallory was skeptical at first. Every time a Teddy cold case got new attention, people came forward with grainy photos, hunches, half-memories. But something about the way Rudd wrote stuck with her. He wasn't claiming to know what happened. He wasn't pitching a theory. He just said, "I think I saw something strange near that cabin. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I think you might want to see it now." She called him that afternoon. Rudd explained that in the fall of 2013, almost exactly 1 year after the Greens disappeared, he had been hiking the eastern ridge above the cabin. He'd pitched his tent about a half-mile from the property line, close enough to see flickers of light if the forest was still. Back then, he hadn't known anything about the case. He didn't even know the cabin had a history. He was just filming B-roll for a backpacking video, campfire shots, night audio, fog rolling in at sunrise. The footage had been archived for years, shot on a cheap DSLR and never uploaded. He only rediscovered it recently while pulling old files for a YouTube retrospective. When he reached the footage from that weekend, something in the audio made him pause. Around 2:30 a.m., the camera was facing outward from his tent flap. Crickets, wind, and then a low mechanical hum, steady, faint, too rhythmic to be windy, too sustained to be an animal. Rudd had assumed at the time it was someone's camping gear, a heater or fan. But when he mapped his position recently, he realized something unsettling. The sound wasn't coming from the tree line. It was coming from the direction of the cabin, a cabin that, officially, was supposed to be vacant. Even more disturbing was what came next. At 2:43 a.m., the camera, still recording on its interval setting, caught a flicker of light through the trees. Just one frame. A single flash. Rudd enhanced it. The shot was grainy, but you could make out the outline of the cabin window, and in that window, a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. He hadn't seen it at the time. He was asleep. No footsteps, no voices, just that hum, just that flicker. But now, knowing what had been discovered in the fireplace, knowing the case had been reopened, he felt compelled to report it. Detective Mallory and a forensic analyst from the state's digital lab met with Rudd in person. He brought the original SD card. They verified it hadn't been modified. The footage was clean, time-stamped. GPS data from his GoPro corroborated his camp location. They compared the window frame in the footage to photos of the cabin from 2012. It matched. The height of the figure, based on frame estimation, was between 6 feet 1 inch and 6 feet 3 inches. Male, standing no more than 4 feet from the glass. What troubled Mallory the most wasn't just the timing, it was the behavior. Whoever it was hadn't lit a lamp or made a fire. They'd used a short, bright burst, maybe a flashlight, maybe a phone screen. Just enough to move, just enough to look. Then darkness, again, and that hum in the background, likely a generator. No electricity ran to the cabin at the time. That meant someone had brought in power, equipment, maybe more. The footage triggered a cascade of internal review. If the cabin had been in use during that window, late 2012 to late 2013, it suggested the crime scene had been compromised, possibly manipulated, in the months after the Greens vanished. Investigators reviewed all known booking records for the cabin during that year. Officially, it was empty. Curtis Dell had taken it off rental sites temporarily due to maintenance issues. But if someone had accessed it without permission, there'd be no paperwork, no footprint, just ash. Forensic techs returned to the fireplace debris, looking for traces of fuel residue. They found minute traces of hydrocarbon accelerants embedded in the mortar. Someone had built a long-duration burn, which meant they'd spent hours inside, long enough to prepare, long enough to destroy evidence, and now it seems they may have returned. Months later, to stand in the dark and look out a window while the world slept. When Rudd's footage was shown to Sarah's mother, she didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then she asked a single question. Did he come back to check on her? No one had an answer. The figure in the window was never identified. The generator was never found. But now investigators had a new timeline. Sarah's remains weren't just left behind. They were monitored, managed. Someone stayed nearby long after the others had stopped looking. And that person may still be out there. The second breakthrough came not from forensic labs or video footage, but from a dog. In June of 2023, 3 months after Sarah Green's remains were identified from the hearth ash, a new K9 handler named Serena Lathrop requested permission to bring her search dog, Bax, through the woods behind the cabin. The official search had long been concluded, but Mallory approved it anyway. There was still a second half to this story, and Elijah Green had yet to be found. The terrain behind the property dropped quickly into a ravine, then curved along a forgotten section of logging trail no longer marked on public maps. Dense underbrush, knee-high ferns, and rotting pine needles made movement slow. But Bax caught a scent less than 200 yards in. He alerted once, then again. A third alert came just west of a collapsed stone structure, what appeared to be an old root cellar sunken into the hillside. The earth there looked disturbed. Not recently, but not ancient either. Lathrop flagged the spot and radioed it in. By the following morning, a full excavation team arrived. The soil was compacted and dense with clay. As they dug, layers of burnt organic matter emerged, charred sticks, bones too small to belong to any adult, and then something solid, a metallic edge, a rusted seam. 4 feet beneath the surface, they unearthed a 55-gallon oil drum. The lid had been hammered shut with makeshift pegs, branches carved into wedges. It took nearly an hour to remove the top. Inside was ash, human remains, melted synthetic fabric, and near the bottom, a wristwatch, partially fused with what was left of a leather strap. The face had buckled from heat. The numbers were gone. But the back plate, though warped, still bore the faint initials, E.G. The remains were male, adults. Forensic anthropologists began cleaning and cataloging the fragments. What they found told a deliberate, brutal story. The femur had been cut post-mortem, jagged, saw-like marks consistent with a hand tool. Several ribs were broken inward, portions of the skull were missing, but enough remained to match dental records provided by Elijah's family. DNA confirmed it days later. Elijah Green had been buried in that drum, likely sometime between October and December of 2012. Unlike Sarah, whose body had been incinerated in the cabin fireplace, Elijah had been dismembered, burned, and buried off-site. The location, a decaying root cellar surrounded by thick brush, was concealed enough to delay detection for over a decade. But it wasn't random. It was methodical. Someone knew where to dig, how deep to bury, and how to seal the container. Detective Mallory stood at the edge of the excavation, trying to reconcile what she was looking at. The drum wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a decision, a calculated second step after the fireplace. The person responsible had taken time, physical effort, and enough anatomical awareness to separate the remains into manageable pieces. This wasn't improvised. It was practiced. The discovery reshaped the case. What had once been a vague disappearance was now 2 confirmed homicides, each handled differently. Sarah had been destroyed. Elijah had been hidden. That distinction mattered. It suggested different motives, or at least different levels of control. Someone had wanted Sarah gone completely, but someone had wanted Elijah buried, sealed, possibly watched over. Investigators turned their focus to the geography of the burial site. Historical land surveys showed that the root cellar had belonged to a property abandoned in the 1950s, a small homestead swallowed by the forest. Its footprint wasn't on any modern maps. That meant the killer had local knowledge, possibly generational, or they'd spent enough time in the woods to uncover places others had forgotten. The question no longer was whether someone had used the cabin without the owner's knowledge. It was obvious now. The bigger question was, for how long? And why did no one ever catch it? The theory forming inside Mallory's head was darker than she'd expected. The cabin had been rented sporadically in the years following the Greens' disappearance. But that window between guests, the off-season stretches, the unlogged visitors, was wide enough for someone to come and go. Clean up, burn evidence, revisit the scene. Maybe even live there intermittently. Someone who had access, time, and no fear of being found. She pulled old maintenance logs, spoke to contractors, rechecked Curtis Dell's financials. Nothing screamed guilt. But something didn't sit right. A generator had been heard. A man had been seen. Footsteps had appeared behind the house and then vanished. The drum was transported to the state lab for deeper analysis. Soil samples were taken from around the site. The bones were preserved for future courtroom evidence. Sarah's family was told first, then Elijah's. 2 bodies, 2 locations, 1 killer. The questions piled up fast. Why the difference in method? Why was one burned and one buried? And what kind of person could do both, then return to the scene, over and over, pretending nothing had happened? Mallory closed her notebook and stepped back from the dig site. No more theories, no more guesswork. They had physical proof now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that whoever had used that cabin didn't just want to kill, they wanted control, secrecy, ritual, and they were still out there, somewhere, watching. The shift came quietly, almost as an afterthought. In August of 2023, with 2 bodies confirmed, 1 burned and 1 buried, Jackson County Sheriff's Department expanded the team working the case. Among the new additions was a recently promoted investigator named Sophia Ung. She was sharp, methodical, and unburdened by the politics that had slowed earlier efforts. Instead of focusing on theories, she turned her attention to the people who'd worked around the cabin itself, contractors, cleaners, maintenance staff. Not the ones interviewed years ago, but the names buried in handwritten logs, forgotten emails, and payroll spreadsheets never digitized. One of those names was Cliff Harrison. He was listed as a part-time groundskeeper during the 2012 to 2013 rental season, paid under the table by Curtis Dell, responsible for firewood delivery, light repair, and occasional guest support. There were no background checks at the time, just a phone number and a P.O. box in nearby Silva. But when Ung dug deeper, something stood out. Harrison stopped showing up just weeks after the Greens disappeared. No formal resignation, no last paycheck collected. He was just gone. Ung tracked his old address to a trailer park that had been cleared in 2016. No forwarding information. DMV records were outdated, the phone number disconnected. On paper, Cliff Harrison simply vanished. But people don't vanish without reason. Using cross-referenced vehicle registration data and a partial Social Security trace, NG found a match in rural West Virginia. A man named Glenn Hall, born in the same year as Harrison, was driving a truck with a matching VIN. He lived alone on a wooded lot, paid cash for everything, and had no listed employer. When asked by the local sheriff to step outside for a welfare check, he complied, polite, nervous, thin. Nung made the 6-hour drive personally. She introduced herself calmly, explained the reopened investigation, and asked if he'd ever worked in North Carolina. Glenn, or Cliff, denied it, said he'd done some work here and there, but never in Jackson County. Said he'd never heard of Windmere Ridge, never heard of Sarah or Elijah Green. Ung kept the questions steady, watching his hands. They trembled, not with fear, but with a kind of rigid self-control. He said all the right things. No, he didn't remember the cabin. No, he hadn't left any job abruptly. He didn't know anything about any missing couple. He'd moved around a lot and didn't keep records. But then came the truck. Ung asked for permission to look inside. He hesitated, then agreed. There wasn't much in it. Faded upholstery, fast food wrappers, an old CB radio. but tucked between the seats was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age, damp at the edges. A map, hand-drawn, topographical markers etched in red pen and circled just above a handwritten note that read, "Cleared brush, no return," was a red X. The exact location of the Windmere Ridge cabin. Didn't confront him right away. She bagged the map, thanked him, and left. 2 hours later, she returned with a warrant. The arrest was quiet. Cliff, or Glenn, didn't resist. At first he claimed the map was old, from a friend, said he didn't remember drawing it, said he had nothing to do with the couple. But with each question, his answers got softer, more rehearsed, like a story he'd practiced too many times and didn't know how to update. Back at the station, the map was analyzed. The ink was consistent with a type of pen manufactured until 2014. Soil samples taken from the paper's edges matched those found near the root cellar where Elijah was buried. The handwriting, when compared to a signature on a maintenance invoice from 2012, was a match. Confronted with this, Cliff fell silent. For several minutes he just stared at the table. Then he said something didn't expect. "I thought the fire would be enough." She didn't push yet, just wrote it down. Search warrants were issued for the property in West Virginia. A shed out back contained camping gear, trail markings, a weathered jacket, and 2 receipts dated late 2012 for kerosene. There was also a hunting knife with rusted residue on the blade, too degraded for clear DNA, but enough to suggest age and use. The timeline now looked different. Cliff Harrison had worked odd hours, no supervisor, no record keeping. He'd had unrestricted access to the cabin, knew the layout, the blind spots, the nearest trails. He'd vanished without notice right after Sarah and Elijah disappeared, and he'd resurfaced under a new name in another state. And he'd kept that map. I carried it for over a decade, folded and creased like something checked often, remembered. Detective Mallory brought up 2 U's. Speed by reviewed the guest book again. The handwriting on the haunting line, "I remember this place, it remembers me," was too smudged for a conclusive match. But there were similarities. A slant in the capital and a hesitation before the word remembers. They couldn't prove Cliff wrote it, not yet, but they no longer had to guess who had used the cabin. The better question now was, why? Why those 2 people? Why that weekend? Why fire for one and a buried drum for the other? And perhaps most chilling of all, why had no one noticed? Not in 2012, not in the years that followed, not until one dog caught a scent, and a rookie investigator started asking the right people the right questions. The confession came after 17 hours and a single sentence that changed everything. "I wasn't supposed to still be there." Cliff Harrison didn't ask for a lawyer at first. He spoke in short, stiff sentences, like someone reading from inside a locked room in his mind. When they asked why he kept the map for all those years, he said he needed to know if anyone had come close. When they asked about the night Sarah and Elijah arrived, he looked at the floor and muttered, "They came early." He hadn't worked there officially for months. Curtis had stopped calling him in after a disagreement over pay. But Cliff had the spare key. He knew the crawl space. He knew when the cabin sat empty. And sometime in the fall of 2012, he returned, not as an employee, but as a squatter. He'd been living under the cabin for over a week when the Greens pulled up. They were early by a day. Curtis had double-booked the schedule by accident. Cliff heard the car doors first, then footsteps on the boards above. He froze. He thought maybe they'd just unload, leave for dinner. But they didn't. They unpacked, cooked, talked. When asked what his plan was, Cliff didn't answer. But eventually, he admitted it wasn't the first time he'd hidden beneath the cabin while guests were upstairs. He'd done it in the off-season before. Said it made him feel calm. Said it felt like owning something without needing to buy it. But the Greens stayed longer than expected that night. He heard them laughing. Then it was quiet. Then footsteps above the hatch that led to the crawl space. He didn't know if they saw it move or if they heard him shift, but something gave him away. They knew, he said. They wouldn't stop screaming. He didn't describe the struggle in detail, only that it was fast. that Sarah was first. Elijah tried to fight, but it was too late. He claimed he hadn't planned to hurt anyone, claimed it wasn't premeditated. But then came the decisions no one makes by accident. He carried Sarah's body to the fireplace, removed the grates, disassembled the metal air intake beneath, and widened the ash pit. He scavenged dry wood, added accelerant, kerosene from the tool shed. The fire took hours. He stayed up all night tending it, shifting her body piece by piece as it burned. What didn't fully reduce, he buried near the shed. What turned to ash, he left beneath the hearth. When asked why not burn Elijah too, he said the fire couldn't keep up, that the smell had gotten too strong, that he was too tired. Elijah's body was dismembered, placed in the oil drum, and buried behind the root cellar Cliff had rediscovered on a walk days before, a place he thought no one would ever check. He cleaned the cabin, washed the sheets, scrubbed the kitchen. He burned the bloodied clothes behind the ridge and wiped down every surface he could remember touching. He used bleach from under the sink. He even signed the guest book, just a line. I remember this place. It reminds me. And then he left. But not for long. Over the next 2 years, Cliff returned to the cabin several times, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes for whole weekends. He brought a generator once, slept in the crawl space again, listened to guests talk, breathe, argue, leave. He never touched anyone else, never tried to repeat it, but he kept returning. When asked why, he said he felt like the cabin belonged to him now, like the fire had sealed something, made it his, like he was the only one who remembered what had happened there. Detectives recorded the entire confession, every sentence, every pause. There was no sign of remorse, no break in his voice. He described Sarah and Elijah like shadows he had passed through, people who simply shouldn't have been there. Cliff Harrison was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, unlawful disposal of human remains, and obstruction. The DA pursued a full conviction. He was denied bail and transported to a secure holding facility in Raleigh. He offered no plea deal, just silence. The cabin was ordered demolished. It took less than 3 days to tear it down. The beams cracked easily. The stone hearth collapsed under its own weight. The soil beneath the crawl space was turned and treated, though no further remains were found. Everything was removed, everything except the view. Where the porch had once stood, the Green family placed a single wooden bench, simple, unmarked, facing west toward the tree line. Sarah's mother said she wanted it there so she could see what her daughter saw in that last photo, the ridgeline glowing orange with fall. Elijah's brother helped carry it in. They didn't speak during the ceremony, just stood. A small brass plaque was later added to the underside of the seat. It reads, "For those who came to rest and those who never got the chance." That corner of Windmere Ridge remains closed to the public. The trails are overgrown. The GPS marker for the cabin is gone. But the story, after 11 years, 2 bodies, 1 fireplace, and a rusted oil drum, has finally come to an end. Only the view remains, the one part of the cabin that never burned,